Without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome everyone to Division 46 of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Media Psychology and Technology. My name is Christian Aloma. I am the current president of Division 46, and I've got just a couple of months left in my term. So I'm excited to have these last few webinars with you all and to introduce to you today's topic and speaker. But first, just a couple of housekeeping items. One, this presentation is being recorded, and it will be published to our YouTube channel after the event. That means you'll have access to the recording, as well as anyone that has registered will have access to the recording here. It also, just to reassure you, just so you know, you will not be able to come off of mute. All of our participants are on mute, or our attendees are on mute, so you don't have to worry about animals in the background, washing your hands at the sink, whatever it might be. None of that will be part of the webinar at all. However, your questions, if you ask them with your name attached, may be shared during the recording, so that might be part of it, though we typically try not to include the discussion at the end as part of the recording. But just so you know, there is a chance that your name or your question may be shared unless you post that question anonymously overall. Now, to ask our presenter a question, you will be using the Q&A feature that's built into the Zoom platform. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please be aware that the Q&A is different from the chat. I think the chat is turned off for this session today. Overall. Now, I will be fielding those. I know we also received a lot of questions in the registration form, so my colleague Jennifer will be sharing some of those as well to make sure we can get through all of them. We do have a 1 hour for our time together, so we'll try to make sure we get all of those questions, or as many of them as we can today, and we'll make sure that those get answered if possible. Now, today's topic, our webinar, is psychological inoculation against misinformation. We're joined today by Dr. Sander van der Linden, a professor of social psychology in society and director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. Now, Dr. van der Linden is ranked among the top 1% of highly cited social scientists worldwide and has published over 200 research papers. He led the APA consensus report on using psychological science to understand and fight misinformation in 2024, and is the author of Foolproof: Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity, published back in 2023, which won the APA William James Book Award. So without further ado, let's get started. Dr. van der Linden, the Zoom platform is yours if you'd like to bring up your slides and get started.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you guys about some of the work that we've been doing. Of course, a hot topic, misinformation. So I guess I'll dive in. I mean, it used to be a time where I had to show all these examples to remind people that misinformation is a problem. I guess nowadays it's pretty obvious, but during the pandemic here in the UK, people were setting phone masts on fire because they thought 5G was causing or exacerbating the coronavirus. And of course, not just a Western problem. In Iran, claims went viral that ingesting methanol could cure the virus, and lots of children were hospitalized. I mean, obviously, a very serious issue. Here in the UK last summer, we had riots across the country based on fake social media reports about immigration that exploited a real tragedy that caused massive offline violence. We've had the Ukraine-Russia war and false claims that Putin was targeting Ukraine because of Nazis, which of course was absurd. I don't have to remind you guys of the Capitol riots, Israel-Hamas conflict, tons of visually manipulated imagery about what's going on the ground, which can be very confusing and dangerous during a conflict. RFK's constant barrage of anti-vaccine leadership during natural disasters. And protests. Um, there's a deluge of AI-generated fakes that were spread during the protests in LA, also during the wildfires last year. Now, I'm not a fact checker, right? So like many of you, I'm a psychologist, and so I'm interested in the psychology of propaganda. And so, take this claim, for example, which this gentleman saying that COVID mRNA vaccines are going to change your DNA. And of course, mRNA technology is now dead in the States, more or less. But what's of interest to me is not, oh, people have questions, it's a new technology, right? Understandable. But what I think people miss is that if you look at the history of propaganda, and that's really what my interest is in the techniques that have been used throughout history, um, and if you look at some of the earliest propaganda from the 1800s, so when the first vaccine, modern vaccine, was created by Edward Jenner in the early 1800s, which used the cowpox vaccine against smallpox, there were anti-vaxxers in the 1800s, right? And they came up with these elaborate paintings, visual paintings of, you know, cows merging with humans. So here's a picture of you have udders sprouting out of people's, eyes and ears. And, the whole idea was that if you took the cowpox vaccine against smallpox, you were going to turn into a human-cow hybrid. The basic idea is that the vaccine was going to change your DNA. I mean, it didn't have the word DNA, but was going to change your body, right? And so it's a 200-year-old trope that's recycled over and over again. Same with immigrants eating pets and dogs. We had similar claims here in the UK that they were eating swans. Again, this dates back to immigration in the United States from Asia, particularly China, fear-mongering that immigrants were eating pets in the early 19th century. So a lot of these are techniques, regardless of the veracity of any, single sort of story that sort of fascinate me. Now, of course, the question is, when you give people headlines, how do which one of these are true? This is just kind of a joke, but it serves a point that I'll dive into later. So all of these stories were widely reported, and I'll ask you which one is true. So A, Putin issues international arrest warrant for George Soros. B, baby born in California was named hard eyes emoji. And C, criminal farts so loudly he gives away his own hiding place. So when you ask this, most people think B is the right answer live. In fact, in California, where I give this talk, also most people in California think the answer is B. I guess it sounds like something people in California would do. But the true answer is actually C. So this guy was hiding in the bushes in Missouri, I think it was Clay County, and he passed gas so loudly that he gave away his own hiding place. And the sheriff's department even tweeted when you're having a hashtag shit day. And indeed, sometimes the truth is smellier than fiction. But the basic idea that prompted us to think about is like, well, how do you know? How do people know? And like, is there a latent ability? So when you look at the literature on misinformation, people just kind of pull headlines from the internet, social media, and ask people to rate them, right? And it's kind of weird because in other areas of psychology, we have psychometric instruments, right? Validated psychometric instruments, like personality or assessment. And so we actually set out to create a test called the Misinformation Susceptibility Test, which is the first psychometrically validated measure of news veracity discernment, which we validated over a number of years. Which was actually created by AI, frontrunner of ChatGPT. So before it was popular, we already discovered that it's great at crafting manipulative headlines that sound like they could be true. And so we used both standard IRT and kind of graph analysis to come up with a MIST-8, a short and long version of the scale. We have a methods article on how to use neural networks for item generation and psychological skill development, which is actually very, very useful. YouGov adopted this measure, so here you can see some of the items, right? So certain vaccines are loaded with dangerous chemicals and toxins. This is something like GPT came up with. 42% of Americans, this is before RFK Jr., think that that's true, right? And so government officials manipulated stock prices to hide scandals. And so, you basically sort of go through and rate these items. And if you look at the YouGov data, what this correlates with, so some of the lowest scoring categories come from people who get their news from Snapchat and Truth Social, and some of the highest scoring from the Associated Press and NPR. But of course, the fake news, mainstream media, that's the real explanation for these data. Just joking, of course. But if you look at age, very interesting. So Gen Z in particular, so the younger people actually do the worst on this test. And we recently replicated this data globally. So we got hundreds of thousands of people coming through our app taking this test. And across the world, young people do worse on this test, which is quite interesting. Um, Now, of course, I haven't defined misinformation yet. So Christian mentioned the APA report. So yeah, I chaired a APA report on trying to define and understand the science of misinformation, particularly from the perspective of APA. And so we actually defined it in a particular way. So as any information that's demonstrably false or otherwise misleading, regardless of source or intention. And I think that's actually quite important because demonstrably false content is not that prevalent in most people's feeds. I mean, it's a lopsided distribution, so it's very prevalent in some people's feeds and then totally absent in other people's feeds. But if you quantify it in terms of the amount of content people are exposed to, including entertainment, then purely false, like flat Earth type stuff, is not as common as misleading content. Hyperpartisan, biased, conspiratorial, polarizing sort of rhetoric that actually makes up a much larger section of our media diet, and we wanted to include that under the definition of misinformation because misleading information also leads to misperceptions. And it's even worse when it comes from the mainstream media. Sometimes by accident, the mainstream media publishes misinformation. One of the examples I give in my book is the New York Times, who kept publishing headlines that there were weapons of mass destruction during the Iraq War, which was false. But to this day, if you look at the opinion polls, people think that there were weapons of mass destruction, and that's because a credible news outlet published those headlines. Can be much more damaging than some random fake news website nobody pays attention to. Now, of course, the New York Times apologized and corrected and moved on. That's good editorial practice, of course, and that's what separates it from bad editorial outlets. But nonetheless, it can be much more damaging. And of course, disinformation is intentional misinformation, but it's hard to prove intent in real time. And so we sort of stuck with misinformation. If you look at some of the latest research, a paper came out in Science linking experimental evidence of misinfo exposure on vaccine intentions to Facebook data of what claims went viral. And so they split it between fact-checked misinformation and dodgy information that wasn't checked as entirely fact-checked as entirely false. What they found, and this is why I think it's so important, this distinction, is that the impact of misleading information was 50 times higher in terms of its negative impact on vaccine intentions than fact-checked misinformation. And so an example here is from the Chicago Tribune, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning outlet. A healthy doctor died 2 weeks of getting COVID vaccine, CDC is investigating. So a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting a COVID vaccine, right? That's true, but it's framed in such a way that it engages in a correlation causation fallacy, right? So it implies that one caused the other falsely, and it leaves out context, right? CDC investigates, every claim it gets that, and that's how they work, right? This one isn't particularly special, and so. This actually was the most viral story on Facebook during much of the pandemic. It's this headline that actually had that impact that I showed you earlier, and others like it. So I'm much more concerned about and this is the kind of stuff we see at present, right? From the current administration and also other parts of the world. It's the misleading information that's much more damaging, and that's what a lot of our interventions are based on, and that's why I bring that up front. So if you look at what most people have done in the past, of course, it's fact checking and debunking. I mean, those were the standard tools that we had available, and the meta-analyses show that it's useful, but not sufficient. I mean, there's some debate about effects. There was a recent meta-analysis that showed a zero effect of debunking, but there's a lot of heterogeneity in that, and so I think it sort of depends on how you do it. But I think the crux is that a lot of research in cognitive psychology shows that people continue to retrieve falsehoods even when they acknowledge having seen a correction. This is called the continued influence of misinformation. And there's two explanations from some neuroscientific work that's been done on that, where they put people in a scanner and give them a false story and then correct it. And it's either an integration error, people don't integrate the correction into their mental model of how the world works, or it's a retrieval error, right? So we access true and false information concurrently in memory, and we have to suppress the false information. We have to tag it as false. And so when we try to retrieve the correction, we're not suppressing the misinformation. And practically, I don't think it matters very much because it comes down to the same thing, which is that debunking puts us in an inherently disadvantageous position. You have to repeat the misinformation, which strengthens the memory links people already have. And then there's a high risk of the correction not being integrated or not being retrieved because it's too long, it's too complex, it doesn't resonate with people's social political beliefs. People have some kind of issue with the correction otherwise, right? So there's a high risk of failure. Um, and you are forced to repeat the falsehood in order to debunk it. So, for that reason, I spent the last decade or so trying to work on this idea of pre-bunking or trying to preemptively protect people from encoding misinformation in the first place through psychological inoculation, which, of course, is a metaphor originally. Originally conceived by Bill McGuire, who was a famous social psychologist in the well, he passed in the late 90s, but he did most of his work in the 50s and the 60s, and he came up with this idea that maybe we shouldn't expose people to more facts, but maybe the crucial thing is to actually expose people to a weakened dose of a persuasive attack so that people can learn how to resist it, right? And they did that in some contrived laboratory settings, and then he kind of moved on because that's the kind of guy he was. He has some big idea, and then kind of left it to others. But I think the idea was really powerful, especially now. And so the idea of psychological inoculation is, of course, that when you expose people to a weakened dose, in our case, of misinformation and the techniques used to produce misinformation, and if you refute and deconstruct those in advance, people can build up psychological antibodies, right? And you can measure those. You can measure how good people's memory is, their discernment ability, their motivation. So there's all these cognitive, social sort of processes that are associated with the psychological antibody production process that you can measure that wasn't so explicit in McGuire's time. And he was actually motivated by the context of propaganda because it was the Korean War and the government was all paranoid about defectors to communist countries at the time, particularly China, and they thought they had been brainwashed. And McGuire, the government was keen on giving them the military pamphlets about why America is so great. More facts. And McGuire said, no, actually, what they need is a weakened dose simulation of what it's like to be brainwashed so that they can resist it when it actually happens to them. And I think that is the genius part of McGuire's inoculation that I tried to embody in our later interventions. So people have been focused like a lot on the arguments, right, or the beliefs or the attitudes. But I think actually the key thing for me was the simulation, right, the weakened dose simulation of what it's like to be brainwashed. And so we tried to find a 21st century way of inducing that in people, still to elicit the threat, which was part of inoculation. People have to feel threatened that their attitudes are being threatened, so they pay attention, engage in more central processing, and so on. And the refutational preemption, which we relabeled pre-bunk because it's easier to understand, kind of triggers the resistance process. So I had the honor of doing a advances article exactly 60 years after McGuire wrote his one about inoculation to kind of go through everything that has been published on that topic since. So if people really want to nerd out about inoculation, that chapter came out last year. But we took an unconventional approach, and we got some funny headlines about, it's possible to vaccinate people. And we took some inspiration at the time from Severus Snape. Some colleges here in Cambridge were joking that we're the Defense Against the Dark Arts Lab because we work on extremism and manipulation and misinformation. It's not my generation, but I started looking into these novels. I mean, I guess children's books. Um, and I was intrigued by Severus Snape, who said, your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. And of course, with the generative AI, deepfakes, micro-targeting, the dark arts have been changing, but our approach to countering it has not. And that's why I thought we needed to do something new and use that approach. Also because I learned that in the dark arts classes, you actually have to fight kind of in a slightly dangerous setting. You have to learn how to overcome the dark arts. It's not like opening up your book and memorizing the facts. And that was the inspiration for some games that we later created that I'll show you and go through now. Of course, with the whole politicization of J.K. Rowling, this metaphor has lost some of its value. But the actor of Severus Snape in the movies, Alan Rickman, I did enjoy very much. So it's my ode to Alan Rickman. Um, but we came up with this game called Bad News, and Bad News offers this kind of simulation. You were put somebody in the shoes of the bad guy. It's a perspective-taking exercise, and you're exposed to weakened dose attacks of what it's like to be manipulated online. So here you go, Donald J. Trump, I'm back. Great idea, Joe. By executive order, I'm renaming Canada to North Dakota. Hashtag you got annexed. Um, this, so this was a joke that we created 3 years ago. Maybe something Trump didn't say, but could have said, you know. Unfortunately, this is now something he's actually implied. So I think we're going to have to update this part of the game. Um, but the point is actually not the content. It's to distract people from the fact that the Twitter or X handle has been manipulated, which is a common trick that's used online. And it's called impersonation, impersonating politicians, official organizations. And your goal is to create as many followers without losing credibility, right? If you're being ridiculous, then you lose all points because that's not what a clever manipulator would do. So the mainstream media is one massive conspiracy, hashtag news. Of course, Elon Musk, Doge investigation confirms Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the UK's Prime Minister, was the inspiration for Mr. Darcy from hashtag Bridges Jones Diary. What else are the Brits hiding? This is an example of trolling. Of course, Elon is the master of trolling. So who better to illustrate this technique than um, the greatest philosopher of all time, Elon Musk? Um, and so, basically, this, here you're impersonating NASA, and people respond, right? So it's a game, and people react to you and cheer you on. You create your own echo chamber and filter bubble, and you set up your own news organization, and things start getting out of control. So you learn about polarization, us versus them, impersonating others, conspiratorial reasoning, trolling, emotional manipulation, fear-mongering, discrediting official organizations through denial and casting doubt. We arrived at those six doing years of, well, a little bit over a year of research on what manipulators use to produce misinformation. We talked to people who worked in Russian troll farms, for example, former neo-Nazis. And so we got a good sense of some of their tricks. People go through these levels and get their badge. And again, it's all fake. It's fictional. It's a weakened dose, but it's based on reality. So somebody impersonated Warren Buffett's Twitter account in exactly the same way as the Trump handle is manipulated and tweeted out fake investment advice, duping hundreds of thousands of people. So we took it from real world examples to maintain ecological validity, but it's actually fictional, right? So John Rosenbeek, who's kind of like Bob Dylan, he was part of the Klan and then he left, but now he's back. And so John actually created much of the content and is responsible for the humor. So I shift all blame to John. No, I'm kidding. So John Rosenbeek is fantastic. He's been with us since the beginning, and he's back with us at Cambridge now, and he designed a lot of the content. So I just want to give credit to John. So you can see the results here. So this game went viral on the internet when we released it, partly by accident. We didn't put any name on it, not Cambridge, no advertising. And we got, hundreds of thousands of people go through this intervention, and a small percentage opt in to participating in research. And we had built in a small quiz before and after to test people to see, simple within subject design. Um, and so you can see here that for the credible items, people don't change their ratings pre and post. The darker are post, but for the items that contain the manipulation techniques, kind of like the tweets I've just showed you, right? So we give people these tweet examples. And then we ask them how reliable, how trustworthy, how manipulative they find it, based on the presence or absence of these techniques. And we use the mist as well later on when we developed that. But basically, people find that less reliable. Here's the density distributions. Didn't really matter. You left, right, young, old. You can see here that the intervention effect is similar, even though people start at different levels. Then we started looking at over time and doing proper randomized trials with the control group, a placebo game that people played. And Raccoon, who's now at Oxford, let a lot of this work. And so the setup's always the same. So I'm going to walk you through it once. So people get randomized to bad news, which takes about 15 minutes, or you play Tetris for 15 minutes. People were emailing us whether we're really paying them to play Tetris for 15 minutes. But yes, if you were in the control group, it was quite costly, in fact. And so you do the pretest. But by now we had a set of validated items, so about 18 items, 3 items for each of the 6 techniques. People get randomized to inoculation or control. And then we started attack. This is called the attack and inoculation literature. So we started testing people week after week after week after week for a period of 3 months. And in the second version, we follow up people at the end with nothing in between. In the third version, we just switched out the items to make sure people are not memorizing the items. So you can see here that people find fake news less reliable. Density shifts to the left on average for all of the items. But there's no decay, which is kind of problematic because Raccoon's whole PhD was about the decay of inoculation, right? Real vaccines um, wane over time. You need to get boosted, and so that was our hypothesis. But then I said to Raccoon, I mean, this isn't possible, right? Even with COVID, people need to get boosted. So I was a bit suspicious of this pattern. So in the second experiment, we actually found what I thought would happen, more or less, is that people start finding fake news more reliable again. So you can see there's still a treatment control effect, but there's about 50% decay of the effect. And what Raccoon later found out, what his whole PhD was about, was that there's 2 mechanisms to inoculation that cause it, that determine the effectiveness. One is a cognitive sort of route, which is memory. People forget over time, and you can model that forgetting process pretty well. And then there's motivation. People lose motivation to resist. And Raccoon did a paper where he tried to measure this, different ways of inoculating at different time points, and independently manipulating booster shots. And you get to these really interesting curves. So you can see here, you can see the process decaying over time, which is actually a funny deviation from the actual analogy, right? Because usually vaccines take time to gain immunity, right? So your body gains immunity over time, whereas actually with psychological inoculation, you lose immunity. After about a week, the decay starts setting in and it's exponential. Um, and so what you need to do is you need to boost people. And you can see here the blue, the boosted group, maintains a pretty good level of immunization, and you can see it in the second graph here as well. So it's not perfect compared to, the initial immunization, but you can preserve most of the effect by boosting people. And it turned out in the experiment here, what was happening actually was that we were boosting people by quizzing them in between. Turns out that quiz actually prompted people's memory and their motivation. But you don't have to quiz. You can do another game, another microdose, a PowerPoint presentation, a conversation. It turns out you can boost people in lots of ways. Cecilia, who's now in Copenhagen, um, thought that this was interesting, but it didn't sort of simulate the social dynamics of social media enough. And she was wondering, does it work less when there's social cues that are distracting? So she came up with a paradigm where we give people the same conspiratorial headline, Uber creepy, tracking your every move, which is a conspiracy theory about Uber that we invented. Um, and we invented a lot of this, by the way, to exclude memory confounds, right? So if you're retrieving something from memory because you've read it before, then that's not a good test of your ability. So we wanted to make sure nobody had heard of it before, right? And then CNN or Fox News, right? So it was an identity manipulation, or source cue manipulation, right? So the same headline, but either from a politically congenial or uncongenial source, and then we record people's actual ideology at the beginning. And of course, what you see is that in-group misinformation is much more persuasive to people than regular misinformation. But the inoculation effect persisted, but was not as good. So in the control here, this the usual inoculation effect. People find fake news less reliable, about 0.3, 0.4 D. That's pretty common. And then here is the in-group effect, which is still significant but lower. And discernment, the difference between real and fake, people still discern better too. But it does distract people a little. We were then able to translate these games with the help of the UK government into every major language around the world to do large cross-cultural evaluations. We have one in Ukraine. Games are adaptive too, right? So you can change during conflict. So during the Russia-Ukraine war, we had a Ukrainian version, a Russian version, we had a Hebrew version. India, people have done independent replications of this in India, looking very similar to our initial study. Our own trials in India, we've done large field trials in rural India, which have not panned out as we expected. I think one of the things we've learned was that the biggest factor in how this gets translated is not so much global south, global north, but urban versus rural. Urban areas in Brazil and India do similar to urban areas in Europe, but rural areas are just, it's such a different landscape. People use social media in a different way. Literacy is different. And so we've had a lot of failures actually trying to implement this in rural areas. And so it took us several years working with local organizations on the ground. And in fact, a national comedian that started acting out the inoculation with their grandpa, for example, in the kind of fun, entertaining spirit of a lot of our interventions. So it actually took a lot of time. We've gone into classroom trials in Sweden, for example. We've had collaborators do classroom trials. There's been meta-analyses of this literature showing that it helps people discern better between real and fake news. We've done our own meta-analysis because signal detection theory is interesting, is that people were sort of wondering with this all of the misinformation stuff is that, could you make people too skeptical in the sense that with AI and everything, will people just start distrusting everything? And so what's nice about signal detection theory is that you can disentangle discrimination from response bias, right? So response bias is saying true to everything or false to everything, which is independent of your ability to discriminate in some ways. And so we reanalyze all of our data from all of our experiments. This is a bit hard to see maybe, but this is on the left A is the discrimination panel. So 0.3, that's pretty much the average effect of our interventions, right? Very consistent discrimination. Response bias, interesting. Sometimes it goes a little bit liberal, sometimes it goes a little bit conservative, one outlier, but on the whole, it's about null. So there is no consistent response bias. In fact, this is within studies, the lower panels are between studies. It averages out around zero. So any individual intervention can induce a bit of credibility, a bit of people might get a little bit more credulous or a bit more skeptical. The effect's pretty small, but on average, the response bias is pretty contained, but the discrimination is very consistent. So in other words, you help calibrate people to become more discerning rather than to just be more distrusting overall, which is pretty good. And here's ROC curve, which is plotting the hit rate, so correct guesses against the false alarm rate. And you see that the intervention, when it bends to the upper left, that means the intervention is improving the overall performance of people post-intervention. We have a version for kids called Bad News Junior. We did a campaign with the WHO during the pandemic. We created a version called Go Viral, which was specific to pandemic misinformation. This was our first public health campaign, and with the assistance of the United Nations and the WHO, it actually became, funnily enough, it became a popular page on the WHO website. And we were able to expose about 200 million people to this intervention. We also did parallel randomized controlled trials to show that it actually works. Very similar to bad news, but now you join a group called Not Co Afraid, and lizard people behind the coronavirus outbreak, and you learn about fake experts. I still do some campaigns for the WHO. One of the things that I found with when you do this with real organizations is that people are going to troll them because they don't trust the WHO, right, or something. So I decided to get ahead of that with a new campaign where I'm trolling myself. And so in this video, I'm washing a brain. And the idea is that I'm going to brainwash you talking about inoculation, and I sort of talk about some of the techniques that could be deployed online, and I use them on myself in a funny way, hopefully, to sort of show people that, how ridiculous some of this stuff is that people might try to peddle online. Um, We've done one with the APA and the CDC before the current CDC administration on vaccine misinformation called Bad Vax. So, you have characters like Anne McDodell, who loves sharing emotional anecdotes to scare people, Dr. Forge, who peddles in pseudoscience and fake expertise. Um, and again, we had an evil version and a good version. It enhances people's ability to discern, it lowers their intent to share misinformation, and it actually helps them identify specific manipulation techniques better, which is good. Before Trump, we did one with Homeland Security actually on foreign interference. So Chris Krebs, of course, who was fired by Trump because he kept debunking Trump's election-related fraud claims. Came up with this pineapple pizza metaphor. So how do foreign actors undermine democracy and democratic discourse in the United States, right? They do it in 5 steps, and Chris came up with this pineapple pizza metaphor that I thought was quite good. So, should you put pineapple on pizza, right? So pick a divisive issue, and then say, oh, but it's offensive to Italians to put pineapple on pizza. but what about my pizza topping freedom rights? You're not going to tell Americans whether they can put pineapple on their pizza. You buy bots to blow up both sides of the debate, and then you amplify it, and then you have chaos and polarization, and that's kind of the Russian playbook often. And so we took that approach and we made a game out of it, called Harmony Square under Trump. Actually, I'm pretty sure he didn't know about it. And then we poll people, or show people these posts. Very polarizing. This was an actual news post. Somebody died, a MAGA person died in a hunting accident, very tragic. Somebody comments 1.5 less MAGA billies in the world. And so what we're trying to do here is not tell people what's true or false. And I think that's an important thing about this whole thing. Like we never ask people true or false. We try to calibrate people's accuracy ratings. Right. So even when it's congenial and you're like, yeah, the guns are bad, it's hard for people to overcome political biases. So ideally, you should say this is a polarizing post, right? This is not respectfully describing an accident. And when people go through our interventions, they find this stuff you can see inoculation, less reliable. They're more confident in their own abilities, and they're less willing to share the stuff with other people. And the last thing I'll say is kind of looking at time here. Let's see if we have a couple of minutes left. Oh yeah, we're good. I want to make sure that I leave some time for discussion. Um, so when social media companies were still interested in doing the right thing, Google approached us and said like, okay, this inoculation thing is cool, and these games, a fun science experiment run amok. But you have this big problem, right? It's all opt-in. Like people have to come and opt into your interventions. So we want to help you with that. So we own YouTube. A lot of problems on YouTube, young men getting radicalized, extremism, political gurus, they use specific techniques. So, totally get this approach that you're developing. Um, and those annoying ads that you can't skip? What if we put a pre-bunk there? So what if we do videos? They said, what if you do short videos like an ad, people can't skip. We put it in as a pre-bunk and we scale that to billions of people all at once. Problem solved. In terms of scalability, of course. So we said, brilliant idea, let's do it. So we built these videos with Google. You may be targeted. This looks like scapegoating. We can dose example, and here's some more microdoses of how to spot it online. We did lots of lab experiments, and the reviewers at Science were like, okay, but you need to show that this actually works on YouTube. So we spent a year arguing with YouTube's lawyers, and they finally let us do a real experiment. So in the lab, we had the manipulative versus the neutral version, and then we look at discernment, and it all worked pretty well. So you can see the effects here from the lab are pretty big for emotional manipulation, false dichotomy, scapegoating, ad hominem attacks. So people find this stuff. Red here is uh, discernment. Oh no, red is false, I think. Sorry, there's a bar in my way, so I can't actually see the top. So people find this stuff more manipulative, they're less trusting, and they're, for most of them, less likely to want to share it. There's some floor effects because people don't admit to sharing stuff often. But mostly these effects are good. I mean, if you look at the Ds, these are big effects from the lab, right? So 0.5, zero point 0.6, zero point 0.3. I mean, some smaller here, but overall, these were pretty big effects, but of course it doesn't show real world scalability. So YouTube said, we'll do it, but you can't use any actual issues for the weakened dose. They said we want a neutralized vaccine, like not a live dose. We want to, we basically want um, an RMNA type of vaccine. And so John turned to popular culture, and turns out there are lots of examples of these techniques in popular culture that are not polarizing and kind of funny. So false dilemmas, which is all about generating extremism, right? So you falsely present two options. Well, in fact, there's many more. So you take away all the nuance and you breed extremism, black and white thinking, which is the hallmark of extremism. And so we found that in Star Wars: Revenge of the Sith. So in the video, people see the Star Wars episode, and the climactic sort of scene between Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. And of course, spoiler alert, Skywalker goes on to become Darth Vader. I'm not going to do the whole Luke, I'm your father. But the idea, that he's like, oh, if you're not with me, then you're my enemy. And then Obi-Wan replies, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And the narrator goes, don't join the dark side, don't use these manipulation techniques. And the idea, of course, here is that this is the template of every false dilemma, right? This is its DNA in terms of the vaccine. And during mass shootings, if you don't support the Second Amendment, or if you don't support automatic rifles, you're against the Second Amendment. If you don't support this country, then you're against this country, right? Once people understand the template behind a false dilemma, they can recognize it in new examples. And that was the whole thing with the vaccine analogy, right? That we target people with many examples of the same technique. And so it's a sort of broader spectrum immunity. So on social media, we ask people, right? Why give illegal immigrants access to social services? We should be helping homeless Americans instead. That's a false dilemma. And then the neutral one is a question. Why can't we do both, right? The sort of nuanced version. So YouTube let us run a campaign with about 1 million views. And so the treatment campaign saw the video. The control campaign saw an ad about freezer burn. We were allowed to survey randomly about 30% for one question, and we could iterate the question type within 24 hours. And actually, the median lapse between exposure to the ad and our quiz was 12 hours. So it wasn't direct. YouTube doesn't have any fancy technology for psychometrics, so you could just ask them a multiple choice question, basically. That was $1 billion company, right? And you can only ask multiple choice questions. But here's the results. It was about a 5 to 10% boost. And this is called a brand lift in YouTube. So companies use this, right, for their ads. And they pay millions for a 1% increase in brand recognition because they know that leads to X amount of sales. So a 5 to 10% was a bit depressed at the beginning, given how small the effect size was. But then I learned that 5 to 10% lift on a 30-second ad that costs nothing is very good in the ad world. And so Google actually started scaling this to hundreds of millions of people. In Germany, they did it, replicating it on their own during the European elections. And then poof, the political winds changed. They stopped doing it. They stopped fact checking. They stopped moderating. As you know, all technology companies abandoned all of this trust and safety stuff in favor of false arguments about free speech and censorship. And it's a sad story. So we decided to go at it on our own. So we developed a similar methodology on Instagram now, where you can actually pull. We expose Instagram users about um, 500,000. And then we target about 40,000 randomly to a treatment group that actually watches the ad. So about 40,000 will actually watch the ad. And then there's a control group you can pair it with. And then we can poll people. And we see that, emotional manipulation, 60% in inoculation versus 38% in control. It's a big difference. Young people on Instagram, right? They're not actually very good at spotting emotional manipulation. How about behavior? So we include clicks to reliable content as well. Threefold increase in the inoculation campaign compared to control in terms of shifting people. We have a handbook for NATO. We're now doing deep fakes where we had some success in boosting deepfake recognition. We're using AI to automate the creation of pre-bunking. Biden actually used it against Russia, which this is the greatest example of inoculation in a real world context I can point to, is that we were working with the State Department at the time. They used the template. They said there's going to be false videos showing Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soil. These are actors. They warned people and then they gave them the weakened dose of what it looks like, and then they refuted it, which is the inoculation template. They say intelligence, the intelligence community says that it thwarted the invasion, and Putin had to find a new pretext. So they got a couple of days to get everyone ready, which, in terms of the outcome, it didn't change anything. They still went to war, but those few days were crucial in aligning the West about what was happening. And so for social psychological intervention, I don't think that's bad. We've got it written into the Digital Services Act here in the EU. We're now doing population level models. The models they use for viruses, the susceptibility, infected, recovered. We're using those, but including the vaccination stream. So with parameters empirically derived from our interventions to understand at population level, can we get, peak disinformed, peak immunized, decays, small effect, how does it work? The basic insight is that you need to do large campaigns and get as many people as you can up front Otherwise, you don't get herd immunity, right? Because it's just too weak. The reality is that it's good, it works, but it's too weak on its own, obviously, to sustain population level immunity. So you need large scale implementation. And so we're trying to go back to schools now, given that you can't rely on governments or social media companies to do the right thing. So we figured the best way to start is in education, where we can inoculate youth and future generations. So I'll end it there and love to take any questions. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you. This was fantastic. And I do have some questions that have come up from the crowd overall. The first I have says, have you heard about the debunk bot? What are your thoughts about it?
Yes. So I'm assuming this refers to Gordon Pennycook and David Rand's debunking chat conspiracy, sort of debunking chatbot. I think it's a good idea. I mean, I think it's a good idea in the sense that they don't agree with me on this, and they seem to think that it's just all about the evidence that AI can provide to rationally convince people. I personally think my experience with these bots is that there's a lot more that's happening there. It's that pe people don't perceive the bots to be intentional, so they don't perceive them to have the same biases as humans. The bots are extremely agreeable, they're sympathetic. So it's an interesting psychological intervention. I mean, people form relationships with these bots, right? They trust them. They also think they're providing accurate information. And I think when you add all of that up, I think there's something interesting there. The problem is how do you scale that? How do you get people who believe in conspiracy theories to engage with voluntarily with a chatbot? And so that's the tricky part. But we've used a chatbot. To pre-bunk, for example, and found it to be effective. And I think it also has efficacy in the debunking realm because you can go into depth and you
Mm.
can you can sort of align the chatbot with best practices from the debunking literature, provide alternatives, don't repeat the misinformation too much, frame it in a way that's congenial to people's pre-existing beliefs. You can't do that very well in lab experiments, and so the chatbot provides a lot of room to actually be more persuasive. So yeah, I believe that that is an interesting intervention to explore for sure.
All right, thank you. And another question we have is the failures you mentioned, failures in quotes, in urban versus rural populations are interesting
Mm.
and seem like they point to something. Have you been able to tie that to a common particular factor or factors such as literacy rates, lack of exposure slash reference to other events, cultures, viewpoints, lived experiences, reality differences, etc.? I'm guessing it's a combination of these and others. Thank you for the presentation, they say as well.
It is, and it's hard to. So, for example, I assume there would be some differences, even like within the United States, for example, between urban and rural, something we haven't actually partitioned out. But because the cultural contexts are so different, the combination might differ a little by country. So for example, um, in India where we did this, one of the main obstacles that we learned was that it's not that people don't like the content. I mean, the focus groups we did afterwards say people like the video, they get it, they thought it was funny, they appreciate it, the actors and so on. They didn't get the task. And so they said, why are you presenting me with hypothetical? First, they thought it was real, the social media post. And then it was too meta. Like the idea of
Mm,
rating hypothetical social media posts in a Qualtrics survey, which is what people in panels, prolific and Turk very used to, that just doesn't resonate with people in rural areas. The whole idea of doing an artificial task like that seems nonsensical to people, and maybe for good reason, right? And so we had to go back and reinvent that, and then we still didn't do it right. And so we talked to our colleagues in India, and they said, "Oh, let's talk to how schools administer tests in India." And so we actually recreated the testing in a way that mimics like a high school exam sort of structure,
mhm.
and kind of explicitly told people this is a test. And we got better results doing it that way because yeah, they just didn't get it. In other areas, we found that, in certain regions, women might not feel comfortable giving truthful responses in the presence of men, for example, because of the cultural dynamics. Um, in Tunisia, we found that, people thought emotional manipulation, in countries where there's a lot of corrupt politics going on, people are like, oh, but that's just normal. Why is that fake news, right? Emotional manipulation. I mean, that's just what's happening every day here. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, so we really had to recalibrate for different cultural contexts, like what's going on. In Poland, we had a huge disaster with Meta at the time because we use the duck like quack looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Turns out the duck is a very polarizing animal in Poland, and so the duck caused big problems in the
Yeah.
campaign. So you never know what's going to go wrong. But yeah, we've had some failures too, and we've published those in the journal called the Journal of Trial and Error, which I thought was very fitting. Um, um, but it's not because of a lack of trying. Yeah. But yeah, it's also people use social media differently. So the whole in Africa, in some countries in Africa, people don't get the sarcasm thing and the meta sort of on social media. They don't use it in that way in rural areas. And so we just have to adapt the whole thing to make it more plain, simpler, less meta cognition. Yeah, and so after all of that adaptation, we got some decent results, but it remains a challenge.
Yeah, fantastic. Another question we had, and you've answered many of those that were posted in the registration forms, was are there any plans to label AI videos as AI generated or any organizations working on that so that academics, organizations, divisions can add their name and support or be available to policymakers for consultation regarding misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say most social media companies and governments um, are doing labeling or thinking about it. And so it's about transparency that some social media companies have actually banned the use of AI in political advertising, for example, instead of labeling it. But they yeah, watermarking, labeling, that is being done. I think some of the psychological research though shows uh, that unfortunately sometimes the damage is already done. So for example, when people see AI generated imageries that aligns with the political message, so sometimes the reason why people share misinfo is not because they believe it, but because it serves an identity sort of purpose, right? It's a social
Sure.
sort of outgroup type of function. And so even though when people know that it's labeled AI, they will still share it because it still serves that purpose. They don't care that it's AI. It still makes fun of the other side. And so I'm not sure if the labeling is going to overcome some of these psychological drivers of misinformation sharing. But obviously it helps with transparency and knowing where content's coming from. So I do think we should be labeling, and we need that transparency. But I also think we need to do more because people will still share it regardless of whether it's labeled or not.
Sure. Dr. Van der Linden, this has been a fantastic talk. It's the metaphor of inoculation of vaccine, I think, is extremely appropriate. What I found most sort of meaningful and rich is while in sort of the flu and COVID, we are typically inoculating ourselves against something that's not consciously trying to sort of infect us. What you're describing is a constant battle, it sounds like, against conscious malevolent actors that are trying to infiltrate us with misinformation and disinformation. So even more critical that we keep ourselves inoculated, right? Keep our boosters up, if you will. It feels like a thing I should be taking daily as a vitamin, basically, to navigate the world nowadays. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to everyone for joining in today's event. As Jennifer has posted in the chat, if you want to connect with or find out more about Dr. Van der Linden's work and information on that, you can do so via those links. Also, we have 4 upcoming webinars that are open for registration if you haven't registered yet. You see some of those on screen and the link to those in the chat here. A couple coming up just next month and December, so 2 more left before the end of this year. We'll also be posting a recording of today's webinar to our YouTube channel within about the next week or so. So be sure to subscribe to that channel and be notified when this recording is published. And that link is also in the chat as well. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Dr. Van der Linden, for sharing your insights, sharing your time, sharing your evening with us there in the UK. We do really appreciate it. And everyone have a really, hopefully, inoculated, well-informed evening. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.